Esther Diana. Now, let's do a deep dive into the numbers that are currently reflective of Kenya's taxation regime. Kelly Boss, what are some and what story actually are the numbers telling us this evening?
Thank you so much, Noah. And in this case, I will start with this and conclude with this, that when the joke is good and is about you, is exactly what I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to walk you through where the money comes from, how the government seeks to raise money, that's one. Secondly, how it spends that money on the budget. And thirdly, how much that affects the taxpayer or the Kenyan mwananchi. That's exactly what Diana was saying there and the reactions that Kenyans had. Why is that? Why does this number lead into a financial pressure that Kenyans face? And I'm saying the joke is good and the joke is on you, because you'd find a member of parliament comparing a taxation level with a country that is in the western region, but the development there is very high. So that joke is good, but it's on you. But let's start with personal tax income bands, and let's just see how much Kenyans are taxed, especially if you're employed. This is the pay as you earn. There is a 10% for the first 288,000 per year. That is 10% if you're going up to 288,000. But when you go above and you get to there's a 25% on something over the next 5.6 million. And then the heaviest there, of course, is if you earn excess of 9.6 million, then the tax rate there is 35%. These income tax brackets may be subject, of course, to mandatory payroll deductions. Of course, there is the NSSF, there is the SHIF, and of course, a new government comes and there is the housing levy and social health fund. So that's just the tax band. That's what a Kenyan would experience. But of course, the pay as you earn comes after they have deducted all the other deductibles. And then we move on to where the money goes. Now, in the just recently released budget, which was released on the 11th, the budget is usually released on the last Thursday, just before the 15th of June, just to beat the financial year and stuff like those. You'd find the one I want to focus on is the 17.5%, because you'd find that the recurrent expenditure makes up 42.6%, but development makes up 17.5%. That 17.5% right there is glaring, because you are looking at a government that is going to spend 4.8 trillion Kenyan shillings in their budget, but they will only take 17.5%. Now, in a layman's language, that is just something there. But according to the Constitution, this development fund is supposed to be 30%. And that's the Constitution. But on the other hand, again, if you are looking to raise more revenue, why not increase development? And then, of course, we have consolidated and further services right there. These are mandatory and fixed debt, and it's non-discretionary. That means the parliament floor cannot review these and stuff like those. It goes to pay debt, pensions, salaries, and salaries, especially salaries of constitutional officers. Now, where does this money come from? You know, that's the taxation now. It comes from, as I said before, pay as you earn. There is also corporate taxes. There is customs and border control, import duty. And then, of course, there is agency revenue from parastatals and stuff like those. And then the exchequer also, where the National Treasury, where that is the National Treasury's pot. But again, if you look at all those, you'd find, there's also another one from grants and aid, and that comes from financial assistance from donations, and partners and foreign governments and non-government organization. Now, I'll tell you why, if all these revenues do not add up to the 4.8 trillion, most of the time, many governments borrow, even ourselves, we borrow, yes, but when you borrow within your means, so much that you don't put pressure on the local mwananchi. And I'll explain on another slide the crowd out effect, but I'll move very quickly to KRA collection targets, because KRA tend to have targets and never meet them. In the past 9 months, the target was 2.122 trillion, but they actually collected 2.038 trillion. And moving forward, that deficit is around 84 billion Kenyan shillings. And again, on the previous year, and that's a full year now result, it was 154 billion Kenyan shillings. You know, as we move forward to the next slide, when KRA collects less than it expects, it it expects, then the government will borrow more. And that will cause the crowd-out effect that I was saying. And I'll explain that on the tail end. That's when you see a weaker consumer power, and that's exactly what Esther Diana's story was talking about. So this is the big 4.8 trillion. The budget has grown by 2.7 trillion. And I'll tell you what, Noah, that 2.7% growth is very calculated because we are heading into an election year. And of course, the government has to, put up a posture that is fiscal discipline. And then the funding gap is 1.1 trillion. Now, I want to talk about that 1.1 trillion and its effect to the economy. Now, the government would look at this 1.1 trillion and say, where will we get this money from? They'll get this money from borrowing. As we well know, many people say we have reached the debt ceiling, and that's externally. But government will look locally and say, let's borrow from local banks. Once they borrow from local banks, local banks have a target to not increase the percentage of their non-performing loans. So if you don't want to increase your non-performing loans, I'm not going to give Noah the money and his business. I'll just give government, and government will pay through the mandatory payments that I talked about, the services right there. And so if the government is borrowing so much locally, then there is no money in the local economy. Banks are looking to give the government, and it's very easy. It's only one paper, 10 billion. Between me and you, if I take 2 million here, another guy takes 10 million there for a business, another one 50, that is a whole lot of books, employ a lot of people to handle that. And, a bank will look at it and say, let me get 14% in treasury bills or bonds and stuff like those. And so that is just why that 1.1 trillion is glaring. And the 5.4% to GDP, it says something also. It says, it speaks to the investor from outside. 5.4% to GDP means that if you put Kenya to quarterly, then Kenya is worth around 20 trillion in terms of assets and everything that is in Kenya. But our debt is 1.1, and then that to that percentage gives you that percentage right there. In the finance bill, this is how the government seeks to raise money. And there have been new ways the government is looking at, new pots of where it can put its hands in and say, this is where we can expand the tax base or increase the revenue. And this is no longer a bill, but perhaps right now it's an act because the president just signed it after 4 p.m. news at around 4:20. So the government is looking at digital financial services. They will be moved to VAT exempt. VAT exempt is removed. And then there's the non-resident landlords. There's a new 30% rental tax. And then card payments, withholding tax on interchange fee, and filing deadline that has been changed from 6 months to 4 months. And there's this one time the Cabinet Secretary for Treasury, Mr. John Buddy, FCP John Buddy, was explaining to us the different bills on the finance bill. And what we were asking him is, if I have a problem with filing my taxes in June, why would you move it to April? It will be a bigger problem. But he says, if you have done your business, you just need to file it almost immediately. So he was saying, even by December, you should have filed that your taxes. And then moving on, now, all this put together, the tax burden, what is the cost of taxation? Yeah? So there is the food inflation right now is at 7.7%. That would mean that last year, around right now, everything that you're buying or the household stuff that you're buying right now compared to last year at the same time is 7.7% higher. And of course, that is because of high fuel levies, VAT on transport, and of course, that leads to a weakening consumer spending power. Now, that leads, and finally, let me conclude with the next one if it's there, but no, that leads to the crowd-out effect. As I said earlier, Noah, if government is competing with its citizens to borrow locally, then that would mean the local mwananchi is a weaker borrower because they don't have guarantee to pay. And that is exactly what I was saying. When a joke is good, but the joke is on you. Noah. We take a short break, and Noah will be back with the panel.